Well, first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And I really feel honored to be a part of this. Certainly, many of the speakers are my academic heroes, people I read and studied before I took my comp exam. So I feel really honored to be in the same room as them and presenting. So this is some work I've been doing with my colleague Gilad at Ben Gurion University in Israel. So this is the first time we're actually presenting it. So both I really were very interested in your feedback and how to make this research better, and also a bit nervous because I have yet to present this. So see what the world thinks about it. So this actually comes out of a larger question that persists in the social sciences, which is essentially, how do we understand uneven development? We know it exists, and it's very hard to tease out the variables that explain it. We know that there is disproportionate productivity and growth in some places and not others. We know that certain places seem to be the headquarters for getting the stuff done in the global economy. This is, the work of Saskia Sassen, who will be with us this afternoon. And we know, and this is particularly in my field of research, that the cultural industries in particular exhibit these kind of over concentrations in particular places and not others, and that in fact often cultural production is completely bound in the place in which it's produced, which is why Parisian fashion is more important than Kansas fashion, and Hollywood films seem to trump any sort of other version of filmmaking around the world. That in fact the cultural product is branded in the place itself. So how do we understand economic development? Well, scholars have been thinking about this for quite a while. There is the idea of first mover advantage. If you do create this semiconductor, it's a pretty big game changer for your region. There's also just historical accidents, historical moments. Norma Rantisi's work on fashion industry in New York City explains that essentially when the Germans invaded Paris and the runway shows stopped, instead of New York media waiting to document Parisian fashion again, what they did instead was focus on American designers, which were in New York. And then you just have the basics, which is resource advantage. If you have more timber, you have more iron ore, you essentially have an advantage over other places. So initial conditions and initial advantages beget agglomeration effects. You get more resources, you get more people, you get more financial backing. And again, of course, these things create cumulative advantage. They create more incentive for more human capital, more resources to come to the same place. If you're a bright computer scientist, why would you go somewhere else other than Silicon Valley? It just makes sense to go where the financial backing is, the other human capital is, and the networks to essentially make you a star exist. And we see this all over the place, okay? So I talked a little bit about New York fashion, Hollywood film. We also see it with finance and high-level producer services. And we, of course, Silicon Valley is the famous example of this. So there are infinite variables that might explain competitive advantage, right? And they're stochastic. You can't necessarily predict if it can happen again. This is why we see failed ventures in technology all over the place. We see failed art districts, because it's not just as simply, well, it happened here, so it can happen here. It doesn't work like that. But it does seem that there are certain qualities of places that are able to maintain their competitive advantage over other places. One is having knowledge-driven industries. This is certainly something very important in the post-industrial economy. The other is having a very skilled labor pool, which is strongly correlated with productivity. And the thing is that both of those things produce tacit knowledge and networks in those places, which reaffirms their position. So it's you have to be there, because being around other human capital and attaining information within the industry happens in particular places. And so you have these kind of interaction effects. So in a very practical pedestrian way, on the local level, this works, right? You have this interaction of these different variables. But of course, what this happens in the long term is that it creates a global advantage. You get a reputation effect. Essentially, the things you produce in one region are far superior to the products being produced in another region. And so having that local advantage, of course, produces a very global advantage and what has been called a natural excludability. You need to be a part of one network to really gain. Increasingly, human capital has been the key discussion in this, and the study of stars, which are who are the people within a particular industry that are driving it. We know that human capital flows go around the world. We know that some are prized more than others, and that, in fact, the network of them tends to produce better outcomes than just individuals on their own. So there have been some studies of this, in particular in the cultural industries, looking at Hollywood stars. So my colleague Nicole Esparza and a couple of her colleagues looked at blockbusters and looked at winning Oscars, and what they found was stars really benefited from working with other stars. Anita Elbers's work, she's at Harvard Business School, she looked at how do stars impact financial backing and how do they impact blockbusters. She said individual stars don't work, but if you have a bunch of stars, that actually does seem to really produce good outcomes for filmmaking. And of course, Zucker and Darby's work has looked at geographical advantage. When you have stars located in a particular place, you also see a rise in firm establishment, entrepreneurial activity, and innovation. So we know that stars matter, we know networks matter, we know that networks of stars matter. So what I was interested in, because stars really matter in the cultural industries, is can we understand dominant advantage of particular hubs through studying labor pool mobility? Can we understand how, in fact, or first of all, can we identify the places that this is happening? And second, does it in any way tease out their competitive advantage? So first of all, it's not just that networks matter for no reason. We do know, certainly my own work studying the cultural industries and studying people who are in these industries, is that they actually have meaningful outcomes. That networks of people working in the same industry, of course, are very important to getting jobs, to accessing gatekeepers, to essentially exponentially advancing one's career. So how did we do this? Well, we thought we were being kind of clever. I'm not sure if we were. But what we did was we took Getty Images. Now, Getty Images is one of the largest photograph agencies in the world, if not the largest. And it has a particular category for arts and entertainment. And we really felt that this was probably a perfect data set for actually measuring where star talent pools were. Because essentially cultural industries are very visual, and their industries are very documented, and their events are very documented. And if in fact the most prestigious events within the industry are visually documented, you're probably going to get a good sense of where the top people in the field are at any given moment. We weren't particularly interested in their day-to-day activity. So we weren't interested when they get their nails done, but we were interested in when they're showing up at award ceremonies, when they're getting awards, and so forth. So we took this database, and we looked at it for a year. And we looked at the caption information, and we identified the location of the event, the people in the photographs, the date of the event location, the event itself, etc. So this is an example of what you would get in the caption. So these are just some of the methods that we use. We use the natural language processing to recognize the people in the caption information. We stored it in a database. We conducted social network analysis, and we conducted statistical analysis. So just to give you a sense of exactly how large this database is, okay? There's over 70,000 people that were identified. There's over 1 million connections amongst people. There's almost 13,000 events in almost 200 places. There are over 600,000 photographs studied. We reduced the noise because what we really wanted to get at were the actual consistent labor pool within the industry. So essentially, if you were in a photograph more than 4 times, we assumed that you were a consistent player within the industry, as opposed to just a once-off, getting just invited to some party and some photographer taking your picture. So where are the star markets? Well, we did 2 things here. the first thing we did was we actually just looked simply at where the photographs are being taken. And the second thing we looked at is, could you understand linkages between places by identifying people being photographed in one place and then being photographed in another place? So this is a map of where Getty takes pictures. US, top place, Canada, second top place, and then the UK. So these are the 3 places where photographs are taken the most. All the yellow is where photos show up. And then where you see no country, when we all know there is a country, is where photos are not being taken, full stop.
So does this reflect the database, or does this actually reflect the number of photos taken?
This is a reflection of all of the Getty images. So this is actually, this map is actually a reflection of all the photos that Getty has ever taken. So
if there were an Indian version of Getty, it wouldn't show.
Well, I'll get to Bollywood, because that's a very good point. Now, so this is where the photos are actually taken. Now, what we were interested in is, all right, are there connections and networks amongst the places where these photos are being taken? So the next thing we did was look at co-attendance. So this is pretty interesting. This actually demonstrates that it's not just how important it is where the photos are taken, but what are linkages amongst places? Now, this is Great Britain, California, and New York, but actually, when we looked at the events, this is London, this is Los Angeles, and that's New York City, because it really does correlate with the capital city. New York and Los Angeles have the greatest connections between them. And then it's California, then it's Los Angeles and London, which we speculate is probably because they're both the big film industry cultural capitals. And then you had New York and London. And then you have some subsidiary places. So you have Los Angeles and Las Vegas. You have Utah here. This is Sundance right here. This is both Cannes and Parisian Fashion Week. So you see connections that we really think are both industry-based. Oh, sorry, Jenny?
Sorry, how are you measuring the connections? Where's the thickness coming from?
The thickness is the number of people who are photographed at events in New York who also end up being photographed at events in Los Angeles. So it's co-attendance. So sorry about that. These are co-attendance networks. So a couple of things. 80% of all photos are taken in 3 places. Now, being photographed somewhere is not the same thing as being connected. So this is the Canada problem. So Canada has actually a lot of photos taken there, but it's absolutely not connected to any of the other major entertainment hubs. You see some obvious connections. So one of the things that's very clear is that industry talent pools are moving. So the New York, France connection is fashion. The Los Angeles, France connection is Cannes. So you're seeing film, fashion connections, and you're seeing some accidental stuff. So we can't really figure out the Las Vegas, Los Angeles connection. And we actually, this may sound silly, but it was very important we removed Paris Hilton from the database because she is so unique and her behavior is so curious. It actually skews the results. She had to get taken out. But besides those, I'm not even kidding. It was totally weird. I don't know how to present that in a journal article, but it's just true.
You should tell her publicist that.
Well, I actually interviewed him for my work, so I could send him the data. And so, anyway, maybe Elliot's advising her and telling her to just keep getting on a plane. But anyway, we think that there's some sort of relationship between essentially just their kind of social activity, because no real industry events happen in Las Vegas. But then the Utah connection makes sense. Florida is Art Basel. So you see these industry flows. People are essentially moving around, going to the big industry events. So the next thing we were interested in was how can we understand star position based on their individual behavior. Now, one thing that is different in the cultural industries from other industries is that stars are defined in 2 different ways, right? So stars are people who win Oscars, so they're industry driven, and they're also media stars, and they genuinely both are important in different ways. And so you can't actually measure them the same way. So this was our proxy for prestige driven stars. We used Forbes star currency. Forbes Star Currency is actually, it's a pretty solid database. It's 1,410 actors and actresses surveyed by Forbes. They surveyed top Hollywood executives and essentially said how much value does this particular actor or actress contribute? Is it that they draw other financial backing? Do they draw other stars? Do they draw box office receipts? And then they're given a composite score. So these are, 2009 was the first time Star Currency came out. These are the top people, Will Smith. And actually, you know, I do a lot of interviews with people who work and run Hollywood, and they say the same, they say all of these are the usual suspects, so the survey data matches up to anecdotally what I've gotten in my own interviews. So the next thing we did was we looked at media-driven stars. And so we looked at Google News and blog search, and who is everyone talking about, right? And we then looked, we compiled all of the data sets, and we narrowed down that 71,000 people to 864. Because 864 people show up in Star Currency, in Getty, and in Google Media, okay? So you have consistency across all measures. So the next thing we did was we identified independent variables. So we looked at the geographical locations where they might be showing up. We calculated the number of times people were also photographed showing up as a once-off appearance. Okay, so did you have to theoretically bounce from New York to Los Angeles to show up at the Oscars? Or were you actually recorded at another event in LA before you ended up at the Oscars? Okay, so this is the difference between, did you have to take a theoretical flight, or have you just been spending time in some particular place? And those were two other variables considered. Then we ran a standard linear regression model. We had a dependent variable Star Currency in one model. We had the other dependent variable was media volume, and the independent variables were the same in both. Just to clarify, we're not pointing a causal direction here. We're not saying that we see causation, and that's actually something that will be interesting to talk about with you as to how, if that's even possible to tease out. What we found, however, was that you could actually understand you could understand star position based on the geographical behavior. There was certainly a typology that seemed to be emerging. One thing that's very interesting is Los Angeles has no influence in Star Currency. If you show, LA doesn't even, it gets taken out of the model pretty quickly. Amsterdam and London were the most important. And one of the other things is that sticking around a place, as in if you don't have to take a theoretical flight, that also declines your Star Currency. Now, media is a different story. Los Angeles actually is important. New York and Florida are also more important. And actually, even though in general sticking around one place isn't a great idea for media stars, it is okay when it comes to Los Angeles. Now, why might this be? Okay, well, before I get into that, starless hubs. Las Vegas is, you know, a terrible idea. It does not help your Star Currency, and it does not help your media volume. London is actually the only important cultural hub that also helps influence your Star Currency and your media. I've been calling this the London effect because it's not as overrun as New York and Los Angeles, and it also has a very centralized media. So if you can actually get in the camera lens in London, you're probably on the BBC, and everyone in the UK pays attention to the BBC. So there's this sort of sense of a very centralized audience there. And one thing that I think is really interesting is the difference between the aggregate and the individual. So aggregate, we see the top places, right? But individuals actually have to step out of those places. They have to demonstrate unique behavior. Los Angeles, we think, is pretty important for media, because Los Angeles is a center of media. It is a center of both paparazzi and just media publications, and so essentially they're taking pictures of somebody. But that's not the same thing as being at an important event, and we'll talk a little bit about the limitations of the data in that respect. I'll get into that in a second. So they're passing through hubs, and prestigious film events happen in other places. Again, media simply takes pictures of things that are in front of it to a certain extent. I don't want to say the media is lazy, but it just makes sense for them to do that. Las Vegas how can you understand Las Vegas? In some ways, we really associate Las Vegas with frivolity and fun, and a sort of, if anyone in here at all pays attention to entertainment news, it does always seem that stars are going to Las Vegas, but it's not an important industry hub, and that is actually really important. It actually doesn't matter if someone's throwing a birthday party there. That's not going to get the people from Entertainment Weekly on a plane to go there. So there actually isn't, it's not a meaningful social event. So what are some of the problems with the data set? Well, there's obviously an endogeneity problem, right? Are A-list stars because they're showing up in Japan and London? Or are they showing up in Japan and London because they're A-list stars and they're invited to those events? So of course there is this, tension between the two, that which begets which. Also, there is the media problem. I think Canada is an interesting counterfactual to that, but is media essentially just explaining star position? We're noticing that stars' geobehavior is strongly related to particular hubs, which also happen to be media hubs. Again, Canada is not that kind of a place. Canada has a lot of photographs taken there, but seems to have no impact on star currency, media volume, and it's not a star hub. Now, this is a sort of larger cultural studies critique, which is who's choosing these people? Is the media essentially making choices for us to pay attention to people, or are we making those choices and the media responding? So this is the sort of, Marshall McLuhan's, is the media the message? Is the media making choices? This is the two-step model of communication. Who's making choices about the people we're paying attention to in the media? The reason I bring that up is because of Bollywood. Bollywood's fascinating. It doesn't show up in the data set. Now, that doesn't make any sense. Now, Richard was just in India and brought me back a lot of Bollywood tabloids. Thank you very much. Bollywood's a really big deal. And anyone who even remotely pays attention to the film industry knows it is a huge deal. And the idea that Getty doesn't take pictures of Bollywood is sort of strange, right? So why doesn't it? Does it not because it's geographically far away? That doesn't really add up. Does it not take pictures of it because it's not a valid part of the film industry? That's not true either. If you look at the numbers, they're not as good as Hollywood, but certainly in terms of ticket sales, they are. And people like Shakra Khan, he's probably the most famous person in the entire world. But of course, he's not to Western audiences. So there is this tension as to who's making choices here. And this is where I would argue that the media is making the choices about these things. So, okay, so we know the limitations, we know the results. What's important here? Okay, cause and effect is unclear, but we are starting to tease out associations. There are certain kinds of places where particular stars show up. And why is that important? Well, this is a preferential attachment argument. This is certainly what I found in my earlier work. Being in highly connected, prestigious events, it's not just about getting your picture in the newspaper. This is actually where the stars in the industry are spending time. This is where the best directors are. This is where the best human capital, where you're going to be working in movies with people. This is where resources are drummed up. So these events are meaningful. They do have very important economic functions. And that, in fact, they also reaffirm the global reputation, which is particularly important in the cultural industries. You need to be there, and if you can get to these events, it can have a very important impact on your career. Okay. All right, so one thing that I think is interesting in terms of just looking at the individual networks, in the aggregate, we see that they reinforce themselves. There are a finite number of hubs. And that, of course, because they reinforce themselves and all the talent passes through these places, they essentially attain cumulative advantage. Everyone who wants to be in film goes to New York or Los Angeles, right? They don't just suddenly announce that they're going to go to Tennessee. Well, actually, they could go to Tennessee in theory, but they really do. There's a certain beaten path that people go on. And while individual behavior can be indicative of certain things. It can be indicative of prestige. It can be indicative of media profile. It can be indicative of neither or both. On the aggregate, these geo-behaviors reinforce Hollywood stars. They are brand ambassadors. So this is why actually someone like Angelina Jolie going to an event in Amsterdam is actually really important for Hollywood. It doesn't seem like it, but it is, because they've invited her to come, and she's essentially reinforcing the Hollywood brand somewhere else. Now, why is this important for development? Well, obviously for Hollywood, it's really great. Stars are mobile, which means that they are able to transmit information about Hollywood around the world. But it's really also very good for places like Cannes, and it's really good for Art Basel, okay? Because if stars are mobile, and we also know that even though there's these 3 really big hubs, there's all these other industry-specific hubs. And this is what Robert Redford did with Sundance, right? Is that Sundance is a choice. It's let's create this really cool film festival in Utah and invite all of these really prestigious people in the industry to come. It's now on the map. That was an active choice. Now, Sundance has become somewhat overrun, but we see the same thing happen with Cannes. We see the same thing with Art Basel Miami. These are choices that can be made because stars are mobile. They're incredibly attractive to the media. The media pays attention to them, and by extension, they pay attention to the places where they're being photographed. So one of the things that might be very important for people who work in this is that it's actually worth, if you're looking at development, it's not just let's create an art district, let's create one that people want to pay attention to. The media on a day-to-day basis isn't mobile, but they will get on a plane if they have to. And this is why you see these really weird things like some Russian oligarch throwing a party at St. Bart's and Marc Jacobs is there. And it's really strange, but suddenly that party's in the news and people are paying attention to that place. So there are these ways in which that the media essentially can be, I'm not saying, manipulated I think is probably a good word, to actually take photographs of places, and that in fact can have a resounding effect on the place itself. So I think on the whole, this is more important for cultural industries than other industries. In some ways, it just reinforces what we know about industrial location, industrial development. Some places are disproportionately more advantaged than others. Things happen in those places, they reinforce their position, and talent plays a very key role in this. But it's particularly important in the cultural industries because they're taste-driven, and they require buzz, they require people paying attention to them. It's not just, I just created this great computer or this great car, it's why do you care about this movie or this musician or this pair of shoes? Well, it has a lot to do with what Richard Caves would call certifiers, people who say you should pay attention to it. And also, cultural industries work together. And so, of course, why did we start paying attention to Art Basel Miami and Fashion Week? We didn't actually 10 years ago, because people like Beyonce showed up. And that was actually important. The media care about her, so by extension, they care about the event she goes to. And suddenly, Fashion Week is front page news on the New York Times. So anyway, thank you guys. And these are our emails, so please feel free to send us stuff. We'd really love to improve this as much as possible.
So discussing this will be Gary Painter, and I will keep your time.
Okay, well, I'll be short, and I'm going to let Elizabeth keep the microphone because I think what we're really interested in is asking her questions about her very interesting work. I thought that the paper really gives a terrific introduction, in fact, to the whole symposium. To really think about why do we have these uneven patterns of development. Those first few slides I thought were just terrific for us. And I thought that sort of interesting question that I really liked was sort of this notion of this competitive advantage. How do you reinforce competitive advantage? How do you recapture competitive advantage if it's lost? And how do you create a competitive advantage if it's not? Your example of Sundance, in a way, is trying to imagine a place creating a hub for itself and therefore creating these sort of places where economic development can come together. So in some ways for cities, what I'd love Elizabeth to do to sort of push on this paper is to, as she continues, is to sort of link back. What does it say to those great questions at the beginning, sort of this particular analysis to sort of reinforce, does it tell us something about this competitive advantage argument, and sort of what drives what? And so I basically have a couple of comments about the analysis itself, and the rest of it is more, I think, just going to be to try to link some of the ideas, maybe as we go through the symposium, back to sort of this notion of where, what does it mean for star networks and so forth, and linking it back to some of the work that we see in technology, either Darby's work or others that have tried to look at sort of how these hubs of innovation sort of take place. So one of the things about the data, there's sort of a couple things that I didn't know just from looking at the presentation. Is there a temporal dimension to the data that you can exploit? So I would imagine that you actually have these pictures are over time.
Yeah.
Right? And so if that's the case, the fact that you have these sort of two independent or dependent variables that you're analyzing separately, it might make sense to think about them as one perhaps causing the other in a way. So when I read your slides and looked at your presentation and your discussion of the results, it sort of came to my mind that there's this complex, so you have this sort of volume thing happening, media volume, that in some sense perhaps creates who might be the star, and then these stars get invited to particular places, which reinforces their sort of whatever the immature as a star. And so what I wondered is if you could somehow sort of figure out at what point does media volume then turn into the star quotient, and therefore then these people show up at these hubs, and so then that makes those links real. Because what's also kind of clear in the data, as you described with the Bollywood sort of counterexample, is that it might be the case that these other places have much less media presence. Therefore, the reason LA doesn't show up in terms of the star quotient is because they take pictures of everybody,
Well, yeah,
right?
that's exactly it.
And so you have such a small media sort of presence in London relative to LA that the only people they're going to focus on are people who are already deemed stars. So some of these networks that are there are because people have already achieved a certain level of star, and that might be generated by the media. Certainly this paper you joked about sort of giving it to Paris Hilton's agent, but you could imagine that at some level, you could actually tease out threshold effects perhaps about sort of once you get to a certain level of media volume, when does it sort of make sense for you to sort of link it as a star and these sorts of things. I don't think that's where you want to push your research, of course, but you could get rich that way.
We did find that actually, that there, Paris Hilton, because the other thing we've done with this data set is run social network analysis, and that wasn't really appropriate for today's discussion, but Paris Hilton, we did keep her in the data set, and what you find is that she exhibits diminishing returns. So she socializes with everyone else, but there's just a finite number of people because it's still an elite network, so you can only meet so many new people at parties if you go to every party. But someone like Angelina Jolie, actually, I can't remember what it was, I want to say she theoretically meets 60 new people at every party because she's oddly quite a reticent, not particularly social individual. So.
Right. And so this notion of sort of a new star versus an established star is, I think, interesting, and then it goes back to the first argument about sort of competitive advantage. So how do you create competitive advantage for you? As a star here, as sort of your data speak to. But then you could think about it back to the city case or the development case, right? So how do you become an established star? What makes a new star established so that then you sort of achieve this elite level? And so it's an analogy, and it may be a weak analogy, but it's something that I think the data might be able to sort of allow you to tease out because you do have this temporal dimension that I think would be quite interesting. And I think it also does say something about the sort of the way human capital sort of flows, and it would be, over time interesting to compare this work to other human capital flows. Certainly knowledge flows in much the same way, yet there's still agglomeration at particular nodes. And so the comparison, because it's not my research area, may have already been made, so I apologize to those in the audience if you know these links, but I think that would be quite interesting as well. So I'm going to turn it back over to you and to the audience to sort of ask your questions. So maybe you have a comment or two.
Elizabeth.
Hi.
Fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
But one question that I have is, maybe two. Were you just focusing on the film media, or it also included music and other forms of entertainment?
Two
stuff?
tiers. Yeah, the first map, you were here for it. The first maps, the co-attendants, and the map of the world where Getty takes photographs were all people involved in the Getty data set. But then when we looked, we did the statistical analysis, we just looked at the case of the film industry.
I'm curious why, for example, Nashville, Tennessee wouldn't show up in there. But the larger question is, so if you began your presentation by talking about the uneven development, economic development, So my question is, to what extent these concentration of stars and linkages and so forth helps us to understand the nature of the industry and how it is performing. I mean, true, we have all this buzz going on in Hollywood and Los Angeles, but the studios are doing the production outside Los Angeles. So the part of the industry's work is going out. So is there then, I mean, how can you sort of predict what is happening with the industry from this analysis, or whether your data could allow you to sort of check that?
Well, I think it actually, in many ways, and it's too bad Saskia is not here yet, but her work would very much draw parallel to this, because Sassen's work, of course, talks about the notion of these headquarter cities. So this sort of stuff of innovation and running the industries happen in these hubs, and then it happens in other places. And I think it's the same thing with Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood has been for some time concerned about runaway production. The power players are here. They're not going anytime soon. I mean, there is runaway production for sure, and there has been vertical disintegration, but it's not the same thing as Steven Spielberg deciding to live in Ohio. And until he makes that choice, the actors are going to still come, and so are the screenwriters. So the innovation is still happening here, and I think that's in many ways, this data set reflects those people, because the photographs are taken of the people who are essentially running the industry and the stars within the industry, rather than the actual, in many ways, pedestrian day-to-day. All right, we're filming here, guys. We're getting up at 3 a.m. in Nashville or Vancouver. That's not what this data set's a very different one from that. But a good point. It's certainly been the industry is certainly split off to other locales.
I mean, in Los Angeles, the whole city is constantly worried about losing jobs and people moving out and so forth, and they're developing all kinds of incentive to keep these production here. So there is an interesting public policy kind of linkage to that too.
Michael, yeah.
I mean, if we want to talk about Hollywood, I mean, I think the pretty consistent finding since the 1980s is that you have a split locational structure. One is where you do filming, the other is where the structure of permanent employment and resources and assets in the industry is. And in that sense, Los Angeles' position has actually strengthened over the last few decades, right? The location quotient for Los Angeles and its percentage of total national employment in the industry continues to rise. What continues to change is how much of the production budgets are spent outside of Los Angeles. But that becomes a more complicated thing than it might appear, because when a studio shoots in another location, a great deal of the budget is actually spent on people and equipment from Los Angeles. So what you have to do is decompose the on-location effect into the part that is spent on local resources in those economies versus resources that are sourced from here. And that usually corresponds to what Hollywood calls the above-the-line versus below-the-line budgets, right? Not exactly, but roughly. And when you do those kind of calculations, you find that, yeah, it would be nicer for the local economy if we shot more movies here, but our region's position in the entertainment industry is as strong as it's ever been. Now, but that, I think, raises an issue, though, of, so how does that link to your work? And there you obviously have an industry with a global market, a highly localized industry with a global market. So you're looking at these events, which are something about the projection of the global brand of Hollywood, that's how you put it, right? In the global market space, and something about how that must be affecting the economic value of the assets that are agglomerated here, like these people, right? And the knowledge they have and the networks they have. And I think that's the thing that really intrigues me, is how the structure of the localization process, how it relates to this globalized network formation. I guess that's kind of what we're all angling around as an analytical question. And I keep wondering, for example, one concrete thing you could sort of threading throughout your presentation is when you have these events, so these people come from here or wherever, they gather together in the global gathering point. what are those events actually doing? Are they transacting, are they real interaction places? Are business deals being done? Or are they basically about social signaling?
Yeah.
Meaning, I'm there with you because you're in the same rank that I am in the asset class of the industry, and therefore when I go back home, my agent in Century City said, I sent you a photograph.
Well, your agent in Century City.
Right, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So but there's a really interesting, my guess is that it's both.
I
That
think
your
you're right.
events in London, that there's some actual people saying, let's do this,
Yeah.
right? Let me grab you and let's make a deal. But there's some of it is just simply, because you're here at the same status event that I am, when we go home, that's reaffirmed your worth to me.
Yeah.
And it will then have something to do with the matching process that occurs in the labor market here.
Yeah.
But it'd be really interesting to try and actually, I don't know how you do it, but
Well,
it'd be really fun to do it.
Well, Michael, I mean, you and I have spoken about this stuff before. Is that, I mean, one of the things that's so hard is this is about as close as you get to these stars, right? Is it's this visual data set. It's amazing how much stuff is out there, but you still can't touch them. So, in my earlier work studying the art and cultural producers in New York, many of the mechanisms that you're identifying, I did observe that these people would show up at parties on one hand because it was the scene and it was like, oh, well, I was invited to X party, so I'm a participant. On the other hand, meaningful economic outcomes could potentially occur. Now, is that happening on just an uber high level here? I mean, I don't know. I accidentally one time got an invite to the Vanity Fair Oscar party and I didn't use it. I'm such an idiot. But this would have been a great ethnography, right? I could have just hung out there all night and taken notes.
These people. I mean, that'd be interesting, maybe, like a part of, like an extension of the stuff you've done.
Yeah.
Would be to actually structure some, questions if you can get access to some of them and say, well, how much of this is, how many
Right.
are you doing deals or are you just appearing? And
That's
what does it
true.
mean to you that you appear at the same event? I mean, we as academics,
That's
we know
actually
that there's kind of a similar dynamic, right, about who you see at what conferences and.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, is you could do this paper also, for economics, is, people who show up at NBER, maybe also show
Let
up
me tell
at.
you, the Summer Institute
Right.
gives me so much street cred.
Exactly.
No, there's certain programs, if you get on certain programs, and I'd be curious about, what, I was gonna say co-tenancy, but that what's the phrase you use if you're both?
Co-attendance.
Co-attendance for conferences in economics, and presumably with the web, you could do this pretty
Oh, that would be very
easily
cool.
right now. Because of course, I'm not supposed to care about, what stars do, because that's not intellectual, right? The truth is I do, but what, in physics, would you find this
Right.
kind of phenomenon? I don't know what their big deal conferences are,
That's great.
but I can't help it, but after Michael's comments, you can also relate this to real estate, which is what we're supposed to do, right? Is to a certain extent, this change in the industrial organization of the business so that the innovation happens very localized, but the production happens in other places makes all kinds of sense. Because if you think about it, Los Angeles real estate is too expensive to be used for an industrial activity like making movies, right? So you go, Tennessee, forget about the tax breaks, that's all nonsense. Tennessee is just cheaper to find land to build studios to, use, and there's presumably a lot of low-skilled labor involved in filmmaking. And it's going to be cheaper there because the cost of living is there. So it's appropriate for the production activity to migrate there. Whereas it's possible that one of the reasons Los Angeles is such an expensive market, again, not compared to New York or London, but compared to almost anywhere else, is it's this agglomeration of people. I have a willingness to pay for my house in the Hollywood Hills that's higher than anywhere else because I can live next door to this other person, and it makes me more important to live next door to this other person.
Right, so, but that's the part I'm not quite linking the whole story. You started on a labor story, but you've got pictures of events. So is this a labor story, or is this where people travel? Okay, so I think I want to see is the linkages and then where people live, where they go back to, where does the informal communication occur? So have you mapped, of these 1,400 people, do they all have places in LA?
You can get
Oh
on
gosh,
top of
that's
the
a great
stars.
question.
I know a guy on
Hollywood
Sunset Boulevard
You
with
just get on the
maps.
street.
Oh, yeah. Cheap data set.
Richard, I can speak to this. So on Saturdays in the LA Times, they have the hot property.
Yeah.
I took the last 2 years of stars listed there, where you know their zip code, the size of their house in square feet, and the price. I merged that to all LA sales in 2008. And yes, and then, so when the stars sell their house, is there a price premium? And there is, until you control for zip code, and then you can knock it out. And so I emailed Tyler Cohen on his Economics of Fame and wanted him to sucker him into writing this with me. But so I wrote this up, and so I was surprised that there isn't a real estate capitalization effect for having Sly Stallone's toilet.
It's shocking.
I was very surprised.
But maybe it's not, it's again, but the problem, how do you identify, you said once you control for zip code.
Zip code and
Well,
square
if you have all the stars in the zip code, you're not gonna be able to identify it at the house level, right? Because the premium is embodied in the zip code.
And so you're certainly right that 90210 has quite a premium, and that I wasn't decomposing that into prestige or other factors. But I had thought that there'd be a markup for having Sly Stallone's house. But the question is, what's the control group? Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, we're good, we have about 10 minutes.
I had
When we need to get Eric, but please, then we'll do Eric, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. A real estate follow-up. When Robert Redford picks a Sundance, the real estate guy in me would love to know, are the owners of land in that community the big winners? So do the hotel prices, do the owners of hotels and the owners of real estate around the spatial cluster, are they the big winners as Robert Redford picks them, a sort of short-run economic development?
That's an excellent question, and actually that is something I think that you could just trace real estate values over time since the advent of the Sundance Film Festival.
And are there other case studies, or is that the best one of sort of these new star clusters in funky places?
I think Art Basel Miami is probably the most interesting up-and-comer. I mean, the Sundance in Cannes, and actually Michael was the one who suggested looking at Cannes, because it was the idea that we identified these hubs, and it was like, well, wait a second, there are these sub-places that are benefiting by cherry picking. So that was actually, Michael, give him credit, we talked about this over the summer, and he had said that was worth looking into, so we did look into it. I think Art Basel Miami is the most fascinating one, and this does get sticky because, of course, Art Basel Miami is an art market, and it's an art fair, but increasingly cultural industries are picking stars from other industries to drum up buzz. So this is why Fashion Week, Marc Jacobs announced last week that he was no longer inviting celebrities to his runway shows. I mean, we'll see about that, because of course that's the reason people pay attention to them. Fashion Week was still an esoteric industry event 10, 15 years ago, and now it's really interesting to people. People know when it's happening, and it has a lot to do with these stars, whether they're from that industry or another one, showing up in the front row and the media taking a picture, and we care about it. So I think Miami's probably the next big one that's pretty important, and then Cannes is a sort of long-standing one that's been just so it's just the best and the brightest of the film industry.
So I'm sorry, Eric's been trying to.
Yeah, thanks. One suggestion regarding nomenclature and one observation regarding the Bollywood phenomenon. Regarding the nomenclature, when you've got these star networks, it just seems inevitable one should refer to these as constellations.
You know what? My husband said that too, and I didn't know if that was too cheesy, so I held back.
You certainly have to consider that
That doesn't mean it's not too.
That's right. You and I are both cheesy.
No, but I like it though. I'm glad it's confirmed.
And in terms of title, because seeing Richard struggling over the title, and for good reason over the title.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful.
Something like Hollywood Constellations, bringing star power down to earth is.
I like that.
It just seems a natural. And then regarding the Bollywood, it seems to me that it is quite striking that the effect that you've shown, and it seems to me intuitively that what it is you've got a kind of sort of competing conglomerate. And that's, and it makes sense in terms of some of these discussions, in terms of a lot of the value of a lot of the events that you're looking at. The value really has to do with how it traces back to the asset values back here at home base. And in a sense, going to the backyard of the competing conglomerate maybe even has a negative effect. So it just doesn't show up.
Oh, the reason Los Angeles is, I think it's because it's just not unique. I mean, you have to pass through LA, which is why it's not indicative of.
No, I mean why the Bollywood is.
Bollywood's curious. So there are people who have studied Bollywood in depth, and it is actually, despite
But why
the
it's
fact
not showing up on your, right?
they're not taking pictures of it. I mean, I looked.
No,
I
but that's
pulled
what I'm
data.
talking about.
Yeah.
Right? Is that these are two competing conglomerates, and so they simply don't.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I'm just trying to, I wonder if there were a British photography data set as opposed to Getty Images, whether you get that result. Because one of the things
Yeah,
that's
that's
striking to me is, so I listen to the BBC in my car a lot, and the main reason is I want to know what's the news that's important to the whole world as opposed to
Yeah.
Americans. That's where I found out that Tiger Woods' confession really was important to the whole world.
It really
BBC, even the BBC just spent, I couldn't escape from Tiger Woods. I was driving down to Fresno that morning. But what's striking is you listen to the BBC, and on the entertainment stuff, Bollywood does come up.
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas if you listen to NPR or you watch, well, I actually haven't watched network news in a long time, but you watch CNN. I see sometimes. You never see Bollywood
I know,
coming up.
that's totally
So I
true.
do wonder if it's an American lens kind of thing, and if you wouldn't have to do an Indian thing if there were a British database
That's an
of
excellent
photographs.
idea.
Because I can't believe that there aren't co-locations between Mumbai and London, for example. Because when you are in India, these guys seem to always be getting on planes to, again, not so much LA, but to London, to Singapore.
You bring up a really important point, Richard. One of the things that, first of all, you're absolutely right that the British news. I mean, the FT's lunch with the FT that they do in the FT weekend everything was with Shakar Khan last week, and they do cover Bollywood. And so you're right. There is this American lens that we're looking at this through. But it is a different industry structure, and this is Mark Lorenz's work, is that, essentially, the media is more important in some ways, but much more respectful. They don't have agents and publicists, and that whole sort of network of the industry is it's a much more informal industry, and I don't know if that is why you see something different, but it's a much more, everyone knows each other. I mean, one of the things that Mark had said to me when I talked to him about Bollywood was he said, they know whether you're vegetarian or not, and if you agree to meet them for lunch, they know you're going to do their film. It's not this rigmarole, smoke and mirror stuff. It's like everyone's buddies, and it's totally different. I don't know if that has an impact, but it must have something.
Hey, sorry.
Chris and I know I've spoken twice, I'm sorry, but Jenny hasn't.
Yeah, I want to press on a couple of things. Gary brought up explaining the time component, and I think you've got some really interesting potential there because you've got rising stars, both in terms of people and in terms of places and events. And so you could really kind of look at this stuff, Sundance, but any of the others that you can sort of identify, kind of coming up through the ranks. And, I think you could push on, maybe coming up with some typologies or stratifying your sample. You can sort of classify both, certainly the types of events. Is there a difference between, the art fairs and, film festivals, things that are specifically industry events versus kind of celebrity events? And with the stars, you've got sort of differences, right? You can identify people who are kind of, the blockbuster type and the indie film type. Do they gravitate towards different places? Do they have different sort of effects on the growth rates on this stuff? I think there's more that you can do to tease out, kind of these real estate effects. Is there a reason why Sundance goes to Utah instead of to someplace else? I mean, if you're initiating a new event, you could, in theory, pick from any place.
Right.
Are you looking for, cheaper real estate, local labor pools you can draw on?
Doesn't Redford just have a house?
Robert Redford has a house there.
It's easy to get there.
Or easy sort of, transit costs to get to these places from the places where other people live. Because for the economic development story, that sort of matters. What's the
Absolutely.
likelihood that you become the next Sundance?
That's it. No, and this is interesting. I mean, Richard, we spoke about this, about the Robert De Niro effect on Tribeca. I mean, how much is Robert Redford the reason that Sundance is important? And why is the Tribeca Film Festival important? Well, probably Robert De Niro. So, and that is actually, that's a fascinating if it is true. We don't have a high enough N, but how much does one person essentially dominate and essentially transform an event? I mean, is it the fact that, you know, they are so revered in the industry and they decide to have a film festival that's why we care, and if anyone else did it, it just wouldn't be the same. I don't know, Jenny, I think that's a really good point. I mean, right now, and actually my colleague and I, Sarah Williams at Columbia, the buzz stuff that we did categorize the events by industry. And so I guess what we could do is look at it globally. I mean, that's about another 300,000 photos, but we could actually do the same thing and see what events that they're going to, because right now we're just looking at
I mean,
film.
you've got the information in the captions anyway.
Yeah,
So it's just using it.
yeah, so.
Well, that's, Chris, you wanted to say?
Well, I just, yeah, so one thing, so we talked about the Angelina Jolie right at the top of the barrel. So I was at a vegetarian restaurant in Sedona on Tuesday, and the list that they were talking about, the celebrities that come through, and they were distinctly Class B. Like, you know, there was this long list of, you know, I was waiting for Steve Guttenberg to show up, and I was wondering whether or not you'd focused on not the celebrity signaling, but sort of the inferior signaling. So when Steve Guttenberg shows up someplace, what is signal does that send? And so there's another, you know, because neighborhoods go up and neighborhoods go down, right? So when Steve shows up, do you see some thinning of a line?
Well, no, Chris, that's excellent. So on 2 points in that. One is that I think the media stars are somewhat of a version of that. I mean, when you take out, there's a couple of key people like Michael Jackson and David Beckham, but you would clean them up, you take them out anyway because they're not here. But that they are A-listers and obsessed about. But there's a distinct, there's a huge difference between whether or not the Hollywood reveres you and whether or not Us Weekly reveres you. And that is actually why those two, I created those. And it's very hard to say that because it's quite a subjective thing to say, and you don't say it in an academic conference, but it's just true that in fact, Lindsay Lohan does not have a high star currency score, even though she's actually probably in the top 20 of people talked about. And her behavior is fundamentally different. Now, is it because she's just simply not invited to the Oscars or anymore? Or is it because she's spending too much time in Las Vegas? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why it might be the case, but they are different. And my colleague and I did, for another paper we've been working on, did study the social network analysis of A-listers, B-listers, C-listers. And what's very interesting is that A-listers have this incredibly dense network, and they only spend time with each other. Now you'd think, well, maybe it's mimics in B and C, but B does not, and C even less so. So actually, the only people who are super connected within the Getty network are the A-listers, and everyone else isn't really friends.
So Matt, very, very quick, and then we need to move on to Michael's paper.
A paper I'm going to send you, some economists have been trying to look at the causal effects of networks. And what these guys have used is the death of a superstar. So if I work with a Nobel laureate and he suddenly drops dead, does my citation count go to 0? And the second thing these guys are doing is another exogenous variable is if my youngest child turns 18 and goes off to college, we can now move. And so if the superstar's youngest child turns 18, the superstar moves to Hawaii, do the nerds still in Boston, does their productivity go to 0? Is they lose the master?
Oh, I'd love to see that. Who
There may
wrote
not be
it?
the same synergies in Hollywood, but in intellectual production, this gets you some exogenous variation in the sun. Which the planets evolve around. I will send this
Oh,
to you.
please do. That sounds really fascinating.
You know, Zingalis has a working paper on how much does the department you're in affect your productivity?
And it's going down.
What? And it's going down. Yeah, the impact is going down.
Of the internet replacing face-to-face communication in this case.
Anyway, thank you very much, Elizabeth. That you got us off to a great start.